Every empire you've ever read about was built on a lie. Not a political lie or some grand deception about destiny and divine right. The real lie is what the history books leave out. The cost measured in human suffering that made those marble columns possible. It's 2560 BC, and you're standing in the Egyptian desert, watching 100,000 men drag a 2-ton limestone block up a ramp. The Great Pyramid of Giza is taking shape, and every stone you see represents something historians conveniently forget to mention in their grand narratives about architectural achievement. Those men pulling that block, most of them won't live to see the pyramid completed. But here's what really happened beneath those monuments we still marvel at today. The workers building Khufu's pyramid weren't slaves in the traditional sense. Recent archaeological evidence shows they were paid laborers. Sounds better, right? Except that payment came in the form of beer and bread rations that barely kept them alive. Their bones tell a different story than the one carved into temple walls. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains from worker villages found evidence of brutal injuries. Crushed vertebrae, shattered limbs, infections that ate through bone. The mortality rate was staggering. One physician's papyrus from the period describes treatments for injuries we'd recognize on a modern construction site. Compound fractures, severed fingers, crushed feet. The difference: no antibiotics, no anesthesia beyond getting blackout drunk, no workers' compensation. You fell off a ramp and shattered your leg. Your family now had one less income. The pharaoh's monument grew taller. Your children went hungry. But Egypt's pyramid builders had it easy compared to what came later. Fast forward to 221 BC. Emperor Qin Shi Huang has just unified China and decided he needs a wall. Not just any wall, a barrier stretching thousands of miles across mountains, deserts, and rivers. The Great Wall of China stands today as one of humanity's most impressive achievements. What doesn't stand are the estimated 400,000 workers who died building it. The Qin dynasty didn't ask for volunteers. They conscripted farmers during planting season, merchants during trade fairs, scholars who'd never lifted anything heavier than a brush. The dynasty's records, preserved in ancient texts, describe the construction process with bureaucratic precision. They catalog materials needed, distances covered, sections completed. They mention the workers like they mention the stones, as resources to be consumed. Here's the part that makes your skin crawl. When workers died, and they died constantly from exhaustion, rock slides, disease, and simple accidents, they were often buried directly into the wall itself. Chinese archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have detected countless human remains sealed within the structure. The wall isn't just built on Chinese soil. It's built with Chinese bodies. Parents sent their sons knowing they'd likely never return. The sons went because refusal meant execution for the entire family. One surviving letter from a construction supervisor to regional officials complains about replacement workers arriving too slowly. He's not concerned about the men who died. He's annoyed about the construction delay. The letter treats human death like a supply chain issue. The Romans perfected this model of imperial construction. They built their roads, aqueducts, and colosseums using a brilliant innovation. They made other people pay the cost. Conquered populations provided the labor. Roman citizens enjoyed the infrastructure. The math was simple and brutal. Take the Colosseum. That architectural marvel that still draws millions of tourists took a decade to build using an estimated 100,000 Jewish slaves captured after the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Contemporary Roman historians like Josephus documented the process. These weren't skilled laborers learning a trade. They were prisoners forced to quarry stone, haul materials, and construct a building designed for their own people's execution. The Romans literally made them build the arena where their families would be fed to lions. The efficiency was remarkable. The cruelty was systematic. The Romans kept detailed records of everything except what we'd want to know most: the names of the people who actually built their empire. We know the architects, the emperors, the generals, the workers. Anonymous, expendable, forgotten. But the Roman approach was almost humane compared to the construction of Persepolis under Darius the Great. The Persian Empire stretched from India to Greece, and Darius wanted a capital worthy of that achievement. He got it. The ruins still showcase incredible artistry. Detailed reliefs, massive columns, intricate stonework that required extraordinary skill. Ancient tablets found at the site reveal how that skill was acquired. The Persians didn't train workers. They collected them. Craftsmen were kidnapped from across the empire and forced to work on the royal complex. A stone carver from Babylon, a metalworker from Egypt, a carpenter from Greece. The tablets meticulously record their rations, barely enough to survive, and their quotas. Miss your quota. Punishment. Severe injury. Replacement. Death. Next worker. These weren't isolated incidents. This was the standard operating procedure for empire building across human history. Every time you see an ancient wonder, you're looking at a monument built on broken backs and shortened lives. The Inca built Machu Picchu using a labor tax system called MITA. Citizens owed the state a certain amount of work each year. Sounds reasonable until you learn that MITA service often meant years of brutal construction work at high altitude with minimal food. The stones fit together perfectly because workers spent months grinding them into place by hand. Many never made it home. The Khmer Empire constructed Angkor Wat using a similar system. The temple complex required transporting massive stones from quarries over 20 miles away. Without wheels. Without draft animals. Just human muscle and wooden rollers. The mortality rate for these projects remains unknown because the Khmer didn't bother recording it. They recorded the glory, not the cost. Here's what really haunts you once you understand this pattern. Every empire in history faced the same fundamental problem. Great projects require massive labor. Willing, well-paid labor is expensive. So they found ways to make the labor unwilling and unpaid. Slavery, conscription, corvée labor, indentured servitude. Different names for the same calculation. Some lives matter less than others. The Aztecs built Tenochtitlan on an island in Lake Texcoco. The city's construction required filling in massive sections of the lake, building causeways, and creating chinampas, artificial islands for agriculture. The scale was enormous. The human cost matched it. Conquered peoples provided the labor under a tribute system that essentially meant work or die. The city became one of the largest in the world. The workers who built it remained nameless. And that's just what we know about. Most empires didn't keep records of their construction casualties. Why would they? The workers weren't important enough to document. We pieced together their stories from skeletal remains, scattered references in administrative documents, and archaeological evidence of mass graves near construction sites. The pattern holds across continents and centuries. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Mayans. Every major civilization that left behind impressive architecture left behind something else too. Evidence of systematic exploitation of human labor on a scale that's hard to comprehend. What makes this even more disturbing is how we talk about these structures today. We call them wonders, marvels, testaments to human achievement. We're not wrong exactly. They are impressive. But that framing erases the people who actually achieved them. The pharaohs didn't build the pyramids. The emperors didn't construct the wall. The architects didn't carve the stones. Hundreds of thousands of workers whose names we'll never know did that. And many of them died doing it. But here's where this gets complicated. Because the exploitation didn't stop with ancient empires. The same calculation, that some lives are worth spending to build something greater, continued right through to the modern era. And the scale of death, it only got bigger. The methods just got more sophisticated. What happened when empires discovered they could extract resources from entire continents is where this story gets even darker. The Belgian Congo stands as perhaps the purest example of this calculation taken to its logical extreme. King Leopold II never even visited the territory he personally owned. He just wanted the rubber, and ivory, and whatever else could be extracted and sold. The enforcement mechanism was simple. Villages received rubber quotas. Meet the quota or armed militias would arrive. What happened next became so systematically brutal that even other colonial powers, who were hardly innocent themselves, eventually forced Belgium to take the territory away from Leopold's personal control. Workers who failed to meet quotas had their hands cut off, sometimes their children's hands. The severed hands served as proof that bullets hadn't been wasted. Because yes, the militias had to account for every bullet used. A dead body and a severed hand meant a bullet well spent. Just a dead body meant possible waste. So they cut off hands of the living to prove they hadn't wasted ammunition on hunting. The logic was airtight if you were a psychopath. The death toll remains disputed. Conservative estimates suggest 10 million dead. Some historians argue for 15 million. Over just 23 years. That's not ancient history. That happened while electric lights were being installed in European cities. While the Eiffel Tower was being built. while people were riding bicycles and reading newspapers and living normal lives in Belgium. The British weren't better. The construction of the Uganda Railway killed an estimated 2,500 Indian workers. The project became known as the Lunatic Express, not because of the death toll, because critics thought building a railway through that terrain was insane from an engineering standpoint. The deaths were just considered part of the cost. Malaria, dysentery, and lions all took their share. The railway opened in 1901. The workers who died building it were cremated or buried in unmarked graves along the route. The French built a railway through Madagascar using forced labor that killed somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people. The exact number is unknown because they didn't track it carefully. Why would they? The railway was completed. That's what mattered. The methods varied, but the math stayed consistent. Calculate the value of the project. Calculate the cost of willing labor. Decide that certain lives cost less than the market rate. Apply force. Build the thing. Declare it progress. Stalin took this to an industrial scale with the White Sea Canal. The project used forced labor from the Gulag system. Prisoners worked with hand tools in sub-zero temperatures. They slept in tents. They received minimal food. They died in staggering numbers. Estimates range from 12,000 to 25,000 dead. For a canal that was too shallow for most ships to actually use. It was finished in 20 months. The Soviet press celebrated it as a triumph of communist labor. They even published a book about it. The book didn't mention the death toll. Here's what's particularly chilling about these projects. They weren't secrets. The Belgian Congo atrocities became international news. Photographs of children with severed hands circulated in newspapers. The Gulag system was documented extensively. People knew. Governments knew. The projects continued anyway because the calculation held. The resource was worth more than the lives spent extracting it. The infrastructure was worth more than the workers who built it. Some lives simply counted for less. The American South built its cotton empire on the same math. 4 million enslaved people didn't just pick cotton. They built the entire infrastructure that made the cotton economy possible. Levees along the Mississippi River. Drainage systems in the swamps. Roads. Mills. Everything. And they did it while being systematically worked to death and replaced. Because replacement was cheaper than care. Planters kept detailed records of productivity. They tracked output per worker. They calculated optimal caloric intake for maximum work. They measured everything except basic humanity. The mortality rate for enslaved people in the rice plantations of South Carolina was so high that the population couldn't sustain itself through birth. The system only continued through constant importation of new people. Everyone involved knew this. The math worked anyway because enslaved people could be purchased. Their deaths weren't losses in the ledger, just depreciation. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean operated on an even more brutal calculation. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person on a sugar plantation was 7 years from arrival. 7 years. Everyone knew this going in. The plantation owners, the ship captains, the investors in London and Paris. They all knew. They structured their business models around it. Buy people. Work them to death. Buy more people. The sugar made enough profit to cover the replacement costs. This wasn't ancient history happening in a moral vacuum. This was happening while Enlightenment philosophers were writing about human rights and dignity. While democratic revolutions were declaring all men created equal. While churches were preaching about the value of every soul. The contradiction didn't go unnoticed. It was just explained away. Those people weren't fully human. Or they were being civilized. Or it was economically necessary. Or it was actually better than their alternatives. The rationalizations varied. The underlying calculation didn't. And none of this stopped when slavery was abolished. It just evolved. Sharecropping trapped formerly enslaved people in debt peonage. Convict leasing allowed southern states to rent out prisoners to private companies. The prisoners worked in mines and lumber camps and turpentine farms under conditions that often made slavery look humane by comparison. Because at least enslaved people represented capital investment worth protecting. Convict laborers could be worked to death and simply replaced. The system lasted into the 1920s. Some argue versions persist today. The pattern extends everywhere you look once you see it. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad killed thousands of Chinese workers. Exact numbers unknown. Not carefully tracked. The workers were paid less than white workers. Assigned the most dangerous tasks. Died in avalanches and explosions and accidents. The railroad was completed. That's what got recorded. The price paid in human life became a footnote. Human progress has always been built on human suffering. That's not cynicism. That's history. And the scale of that suffering accelerated dramatically once empires figured out they could industrialize exploitation. The 20th century proved you could scale this calculation to previously unimaginable levels. The Soviet Union built entire cities using forced labor. Norilsk, Magadan, Vorkuta. Cities that exist today, populated by people living in buildings constructed by prisoners who froze to death building them. The Nazi regime took forced labor and added systematic extermination. Concentration camp prisoners built the infrastructure of their own destruction. They constructed the camps. They laid the rail lines. They built the factories where they'd be worked to death. Then their bodies were used as raw materials. Gold teeth melted down. Hair made into fabric. Bones ground for fertilizer. The efficiency was remarkable in its horror. China's Great Leap Forward mobilized hundreds of millions for massive infrastructure projects. Dams, canals, irrigation systems. The projects failed spectacularly and contributed to a famine that killed tens of millions. But the dams still stand. North Korea built its subway system using forced labor. The stations are beautiful. Chandeliers and marble and artwork celebrating the regime. They're also 100 meters underground. Deep enough that thousands of workers died from cave-ins and accidents and simple exhaustion. The regime doesn't acknowledge this. The subway runs on schedule. Modern construction hasn't abandoned this calculation. It's just outsourced it. The stadiums built for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar killed thousands of migrant workers. The exact number remains disputed because Qatar didn't track deaths carefully. The stadiums opened on time. Dubai's skyline rose on the backs of workers whose passports were confiscated upon arrival. They couldn't leave. They couldn't complain. They built the towers and lived in labor camps on the outskirts. Some died. More were injured. The buildings won architecture awards. This isn't about comparing suffering across centuries or creating some hierarchy of horror. It's about recognizing a pattern that runs through all of human civilization. When empires want to build something grand, they find populations whose lives they've decided matter less. Then they spend those lives like currency. The technology changes. The scale increases. The fundamental calculation remains identical. What makes this particularly difficult to process is that we benefit from it. The roads we drive on. The buildings we work in. The infrastructure that makes modern life possible. Somewhere in that chain of creation, someone's life was deemed expendable. Not always. Not everywhere. But often enough that it's the rule rather than the exception. Progress has a price, and historically, the people paying that price haven't been the ones enjoying the progress. You can't undo history. You can't bring back the workers buried in the Great Wall, or the enslaved people who built the American South's economy. You can't resurrect the millions who died in the Belgian Congo, or the prisoners who froze building Soviet cities. They're gone. Their names are mostly lost. Their suffering is reduced to statistics we argue about in academic papers. What you can do is stop pretending it didn't happen. Stop framing these structures as pure achievements divorced from their human cost. Stop treating empire building as some glorious chapter of human advancement without acknowledging what that advancement required. The pyramids are impressive. They're also graveyards. The Great Wall is magnificent. It's also a monument to conscripted labor and systematic brutality. The Colosseum showcases Roman engineering genius. It was built by enslaved people for the purpose of killing other enslaved people for entertainment. Every wonder of the ancient world. Every colonial infrastructure project. Every grand building that makes you stop and stare. Behind all of it are people who suffered and died to make it possible. That doesn't mean we tear everything down or stop appreciating human achievement. It means we tell the complete story. It means we remember that empires aren't built by emperors. They're built by workers. And historically, those workers have been treated as resources to be consumed rather than people deserving dignity. The calculation that made this possible, that some lives cost less than others, hasn't disappeared. It's adapted. It operates in different forms under different names in different places. But it's still there. Still determining whose suffering is acceptable in pursuit of progress. Still deciding which populations can be exploited for the benefit of others. Still treating human beings as variables in an economic equation. That's the actual cost of building empires. Not just the money spent or the resources consumed. The human lives treated as expendable. The suffering dismissed as necessary. The deaths that never made it into the official histories because the people who died weren't considered important enough to record. Every grand structure you admire was built on that foundation. And until we acknowledge that fully, we're just repeating the same lie the empires told themselves. That the achievement justified the cost. That progress required sacrifice. That some people simply mattered less. The monuments remain. The people who built them are dust. And we're still deciding whose lives count when we measure the cost of greatness.